welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about not just the Celtic fringe, but the fringe of the fringe, the marginal areas within the Celtic world, namely Brittany in France and Galicia in Spain. We're going to be thinking about two ways to be marginal, in fact. One kind of being marginal has to do with where the Celtic areas find themselves with respect to the major powers that came to dominate them. This kind of marginality has its roots in the classical period, when Celtic speakers were originally marginalized by the advance of Latin, which on the continent developed into Romance languages such as French and Spanish. Of course, in Britain, they were then marginalized again by the spread of the English language brought by the Anglo-Saxons. That's how the Celtic fringe came to be in the first place. It is at the edge of the areas where Latin and its successor languages, and then English, made their advance. But the Celtic fringe itself has a fringe. This kind of marginality has to do with where the different Celtic areas find themselves with respect to the Celtic world as a whole. This second kind of marginality develops much, much later, due to a shift in perspective that comes about in the 19th century, when an interest in Celtic heritage arose, especially in Ireland and Wales and somewhat in Scotland. These are the areas where the idea of the Celtic fringe was embraced wholeheartedly and proudly. But the result, ironically, was to create a Celtic core centered on Western Britain and Ireland. These are areas where the dominant speech that was imposed on the Celtic areas was English. So ironically, these Celtic areas all had something in common. Their various Celtic languages had been replaced by the same foreign language, English, and they were now ruled by the same foreign power, England, as the dominant part of the United Kingdom. So it was easy for the Celts of Britain and Ireland to feel a kinship with each other. They could discuss their oppression by the English in English. But what about Brittany in France and Galicia in Spain? These Celtic areas were now doubly marginal. They were marginal in the nation-states they found themselves within, France and Spain, but they were also marginal within the Celtic world. They did not speak the same mainstream language as the other Celtic enthusiasts. And in some cases, they had to work hard to get into the club of modern Celtic nations, simply to be acknowledged as part of the Celtic world. How ironic is that? So in this lecture, I will discuss Brittany and Galicia in turn. And since this is their moment to shine, I'm going to give the whole story of each region from its Celtic roots to the present. I'll spend more time on Brittany because there is a much clearer and more continuous Celtic identity there than in Galicia. In each case, I'll give a very brief account of how the area fared when it first encountered Roman power, and then how it got cut off, so to speak, from the other Celtic-speaking areas, and also a very quick overview of the relationship between that area and the larger nation-state within which it later found itself. I'll have more to say about the role that Brittany and Galicia played in the modern Celtic movement in a later lecture, but I'll give a little bit of a preview of those developments here. Let's start with the first area in our tour of the fringe, Brittany. In the Roman period, Brittany was referred to as Armorica, which means by the sea in Gaulish. That was the Celtic language spoken there at the time of Caesar. And the peninsula in western France on which Brittany is found is called the Armorican Peninsula. Brittany has been a Celtic-speaking region since as far back as our records stretch. We know this because of the many proper names that survive from the region, names for places and tribes or peoples that all have recognizable Celtic forms. But Brittany has a very long history that stretches thousands of years into the prehistoric period, probably long before the Celtic languages developed. Brittany is one of the areas on the Atlantic coast of Europe that has the largest number of megaliths, these large stone monuments that started appearing around 3,000 years BC. We see them all along the Atlantic coast and in Britain and Ireland. Stonehenge in England is the most famous of these monuments, but Brittany probably has the densest concentration of these monuments anywhere in Europe. The important thing to note about them is that they have nothing specifically to do with the Celts. They were erected long before the cultures that we associate with the Celts came into existence. But they may well have been built by the ancestors of the later Celtic-speaking inhabitants of Brittany. As we've seen, it's perfectly possible for cultures and languages to come and go while people stay right where they are. Certainly, these monuments played an important part in the thought world of the later Bretons. The megaliths probably indicate that the societies along the Atlantic seaboard were quite prosperous, probably due to extensive seaborne trade. But this prosperity seems to have ebbed in Brittany in the middle of the first millennium BC. Brittany at that time was kind of a backwater. We don't see the kinds of elaborate hill forts or rich archaeological finds in Brittany that we do in Central Europe or even Eastern France around 500 BC. You don't see princely graves like the Hallstatt period grave at Hochdorf in Germany. This is probably a sign that Brittany was not as prosperous economically. And ironically, Brittany probably suffered precisely because those eastern regions were doing well. Trade that had previously moved from east to west, from the Atlantic coast through to Central Europe, was now moving north and south from the Mediterranean up along the Rhone River. The economy seems to have picked up, though, in the centuries right before the Roman conquest, when population increased. And we can tell this because more land was being brought into cultivation. Brittany was changing politically at the same time. In the 2nd century BC, we start to see coins being minted by the three most prominent tribes in the region, the Veneti, the Ridones, and the Namnetes. And these three tribes later gave their names to the important Breton cities of Vannes, Rennes, and Nantes. Other tribes followed suit. By the 1st century BC, trading contacts and political alliances had emerged between the Armorican Peninsula and the tribes of northern Gaul on the one hand and southwestern Britain on the other. It's a fairly easy sail from southwestern Britain to Brittany. In Caesar's day, Brittany was inhabited by various Gaulish tribes, and we see within the Armorican tribes the same faction fights about policy toward Rome that we see elsewhere in Gaul. Some people thought Roman trade was going to be good for Armorica, while others feared domination by Caesar. It turns out that both parties were right. As we have seen, Caesar thoroughly conquered Gaul in the 50s BC, and Armorica was very much in the thick of the fighting. Later, Armorican soldiers were sent to help the Gaulish chieftain Vercingetorix in his last stand against Caesar. But once Vercingetorix was defeated, Armorica settled down to more than 4 centuries of fairly prosperous Roman rule. This meant a massive infrastructure investment by the Romans. A comprehensive road network was built out, in many cases based on existing trackways. But like in Britain, these roads benefited from Roman engineering. New fortresses and urban settlements were also built. Even during the height of Roman rule in Gaul, though, the area was probably still full of Gaulish speakers, even if some of them were also bilingual in Latin. Up until this point, Brittany was not particularly different from the rest of Roman-ruled Gaul. All of that changed beginning in the 5th century AD, as Roman power throughout northwestern Europe started to decline. At this time, people in southwestern Britain began to migrate to Brittany in substantial numbers from what are now Cornwall and Devon and the adjoining areas. This was a phenomenon that continued into the 6th century, and it was this migration from Britain that gave Brittany its name, and it was often referred to as Lesser Britain or Little Britain to distinguish it from the island of Britain. Now, it's relatively new to point out that we can't be sure what caused these migrations. This was, of course, a period of tremendous political and military upheaval in the Roman Empire. Parties of raiders were on the loose in northwestern Europe, especially in Britain, where the legions had been withdrawn. The economy was in dire straits as long-distance trade declined, so conditions were definitely unfavorable. But we still don't know exactly why these migrations occurred. It used to be thought that the migrants from Britain into France were fleeing Anglo-Saxon raiders. The problem is that the migrations out of Britain don't occur at exactly the same time as the Anglo-Saxon incursions. So even if fear of Anglo-Saxons was one factor in this migration, it was likely not the only one. There may have been some sort of economic push or pull that caused these people to leave, but we can't be sure. This just seems to have been a time of great fluidity. At the same time that people from Britain were settling in France, people from Ireland were settling in Britain, so it was definitely a period when elite groups in particular were looking around for ways to make the most of their economic and political opportunities. I think it's interesting to point out that sometimes scholarship makes progress in small steps, not by coming up with new answers to old questions, but simply by admitting that the old answers were wrong and admitting that we just don't know the new answers. One thing seems clear. These people who came to Brittany from southwestern Britain established dominance over the Armorican Peninsula and slowly expanded eastwards. Of course, they were speakers of the British language that they had brought with them, and the speech of the immigrants seems to have swamped whatever was being spoken there previously, which was presumably a mix of Latin and Gaulish. And again, we're not exactly sure how well the British speakers and the Gaulish speakers would have been able to communicate with each other. Possibly not all that well. As we've seen so far with the history of the Celtic languages, the fact that the British speech of the newcomers drove out the speech of the natives doesn't mean that the immigrants were very numerous, just that they brought with them enough cultural prestige to cause the existing inhabitants of the region to decide to adopt the new form of speech. And this was presumably due to the fact that the newcomers were wealthy and powerful. During this time, there was frequent contact with Britain, especially southwestern Britain, which helped preserve the linguistic links between Brittany and southwestern Britain. And in fact, Breton and Cornish are still very similar. Probably the two languages did not seriously diverge until around the year 1000 or so. And there are signs that the literary traditions of Cornwall and Brittany were closely aligned. They shared some stories, such as the story of the doomed lovers, Tristan and Isolde, just the way that Wales and the Old North shared stories about the doomed raid on Catraeth by the Gododdin. So you get Breton hegemony established in the Armorican Peninsula, and thus the name of the peninsula got changed to Brittany as a result. And the Bretons continued to push east into France. But the Breton advance was finally stopped in the early 10th century by the arrival of new people coming from the east, namely the Normans, who were themselves newcomers from Scandinavia. Thereafter, the Bretons and the Normans fought border wars, but under the reign of Duke William of Normandy, Brittany finally came under Norman hegemony. The Bretons still had their own duke, but he often fought beside William as a kind of junior partner, very much under William's tutelage. Of course, William was famous for something else besides bringing Brittany under Norman influence. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was hugely important to the history of Brittany because it effectively re-established political ties between the island of Britain and Brittany. William recruited many Breton soldiers to fight in his army, and there were actually hundreds of Bretons fighting alongside him at the Battle of Hastings. Many Bretons settled in Britain after Hastings, and some of them gravitated toward Wales, where the language and culture of the people was not far removed from their own, not as close as Cornish, but still similar enough to make communication fairly easy. And this sort of homecoming had important consequences for the culture of all of medieval Europe, because this is how King Arthur went mainstream. Here's how it happened. In the 1130s, a man of mixed Breton and Welsh heritage named Geoffrey of Monmouth set up shop as a cleric in Oxford. There he produced a text in Latin called The History of the Kings of Britain, and he claimed it was a translation from an old book written in the British language, which in this context presumably means Welsh. The book told the history of Britain from the earliest days down through the reign of King Arthur. It contained a mishmash of stories about various British kings, including King Lear, who supposedly lived in the 8th century BC. Of course, Lear became the basis for Shakespeare's tragedy, though in Geoffrey's version, Lear successfully deposes his ungrateful daughters and Cordelia succeeds him on the throne. Shakespeare is the one who makes it into a tragedy. The most appealing sections of Geoffrey of Monmouth's text deal with Arthur, of course, and Geoffrey clearly drew on legends that had been circulating in Wales and the other British-speaking parts of the British Isles for centuries. The funny thing about Geoffrey of Monmouth, though, is that this whole backstory about the book he was supposedly translating was made up. There was probably never a book in the British language that he was translating from. He just claimed there was, because that sounded a bit more impressive and prestigious than his real source, which was a lot of oral tradition and some stuff he invented himself. But lots and lots of people believed him. And the stories in Geoffrey of Monmouth's work became the basis for the smash literary sensation of the 12th century and beyond, Arthurian literature. The reason that this story of literary influence matters to our story here is that Geoffrey of Monmouth was part of a cultural milieu that straddled the English Channel. Stories that may have once been part of a common literary heritage for the British-speaking world were brought back and reintroduced into Brittany, especially the stories concerning King Arthur. And the Bretons adopted Arthur as their own. And the Arthur stories helped to foster a kind of Breton nationalism. This was important because while Brittany may have been on the geographic margins of France, it played an important part in the power struggles that plagued Western France in the 12th century. That is because during this period, the kings of England were also great feudal magnates in France. The English kings controlled most of the western seaboard of France, but they were perpetually at war with their supposed feudal overlords, the kings of France. So where does Brittany specifically come into the story? As I said, the idea that Arthur had been the leader of a proud people with a glorious past was very popular in Brittany, where the Bretons were chafing under the overlordship first of the Norman dukes and then of the English kings. In the late 12th century, the Duke of Brittany had no sons, so the heir to the duchy was his daughter Constance. She was married to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the son of King Henry II of England. The idea was that Geoffrey would eventually rule Brittany as Constance's husband. However, Geoffrey died young before he could take the ducal throne. He left a daughter, Eleanor, named after Geoffrey's famous mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. But his wife Constance, the heiress to the Duchy of Brittany, was pregnant when her husband died, and the baby turned out to be a boy. What did they name him? Arthur. By giving the young prince the name of a famous British ruler, the Bretons were making a statement. They were great in the past, and they would be great again. Unfortunately, Arthur suffered a melancholy fate. He got entangled in the very complicated politics surrounding the succession to the English throne. And here is where I get to sneak in a mention of Richard the Lionheart, even though nobody would argue that he was a Celt. So many people know that Richard was famous for going on crusade, and he was fairly successful in achieving some carefully circumscribed goals in the East, but he didn't manage to capture Jerusalem. On his return to Europe, he was captured himself by the vassal of one of his most powerful enemies, and England had to pay a huge ransom for him to be released. The rest of his reign was spent cleaning up the damage that was done to his authority in all of his domains, both English and French, by his long absence, first on crusade and then in captivity. It was in one such cleanup exercise in 1199 that Richard received a fatal arrow wound. He left several possible heirs. One was his only surviving legitimate brother, Prince John, who was widely loathed. Among other adventures, he had conspired with the great enemy of England, King Philip Augustus of France, to keep Richard from being released from captivity. The other possible heir was John's nephew, the 12-year-old Prince Arthur, who was the son of John's deceased older brother Geoffrey. So we have here a classic case of uncle pitted against nephew. King Philip of France decided to exploit this succession struggle, and he backed Prince Arthur. It was better for France to have a young and inexperienced King of England instead of a full-grown man, even one as unpopular as John. Over the next couple of years, John and Arthur fought for the succession. And finally, in 1202, John captured Arthur, and the boy was never seen again. Rumors circulated about his fate. John almost certainly had him killed, although there were some reports that John had actually done the evil deed himself. But the joke was on John, because this probable murder of Arthur, among other factors, helped to turn public opinion against him, and within a few years he had lost most of his lands in France to the French king. And Brittany re-established its autonomy within France. It was essentially independent. And the Bretons clung fiercely to their independence, even in the face of the machinations of two very powerful potential overlords, England and France. And they managed to hold off political subordination all the way until the late 15th century, when the ducal line failed in the male line, and Anne, Duchess of Brittany, married two French kings in succession. And this union finally cemented the incorporation of Brittany within the French kingdom. Although Breton political autonomy was officially at an end, Breton the language survived, and until fairly recently, it was the most widely spoken of the Celtic languages. Even in the 1980s, there were possibly 1 million speakers of Breton. That number has since declined precipitously to about 500,000 speakers, and Breton is now outstripped by Welsh in the number of active speakers of the language. Still, the survival of Breton is a powerful testament to the strength of Breton identity, because it occurred in the face of strong official opposition from the central French government. Supposedly, there were signs on school walls in Brittany that read, "Il est interdit de parler breton et de cracher par terre," which means, "It is forbidden to speak Breton and to spit on the floor." It turns out that no such actual signs have ever been found. So this is probably a myth propagated by language activists who see an advantage in exaggerating the opposition they have had to face in preserving the Breton language. Today, many aspects of traditional Breton culture still flourish, including music, of course, which I will talk about much more in a later lecture. But for now, I'll just mention a few famous Bretons. The medieval cleric Peter Abelard, the ill-fated husband of Heloise, was from Brittany. He spent some time in exile at a monastery in the far reaches of Brittany, where he was apparently so unpopular with his monks that they tried to poison him. Other famous Bretons include the explorer Jacques Cartier, who claimed Canada for France, and the science fiction writer Jules Verne. Let's move on now to the other region I want to talk about in this lecture. The story of Galicia is in some respects similar to the story of Brittany, but there are also key differences between the two cases. One very important point to start with is that Galicia has had one of the most varied experiences of any of the Celtic-speaking regions. Galicia has an unimpeachable Celtic pedigree, but unlike Brittany, it preserves very little of the Celtic language that was originally spoken there. The region is named for the Galici, the Celtic-speaking people who lived in northwestern Iberia in the first millennium BC. They were conquered by the Romans during the reign of Augustus, around the turn of the millennia, and they were ruled by Rome thereafter until 410 AD, when the Germanic tribe known as the Suebi settled in the region. The Suebi, in their turn, were conquered by another Germanic people, the Visigoths, who established hegemony over most of Spain in the 6th century. And here we come to one of the key similarities between Galicia and Brittany. Like Brittany, Galicia also received an infusion of Celtic speakers from Britain in the 5th century, at just the time that other groups of people from Western Britain were settling in Brittany. These British incomers were so numerous, in fact, that in 569, at the Church Council of Lugo, they were assigned their own bishop. But there was a key difference between Galicia and Brittany. Unlike in Brittany, where the newcomers provided a kind of Celtic transfusion, In Galicia, the newcomers did not lead to the establishment and preservation of a Celtic language as the local vernacular. And this is because, by the period of the British migrations, the Celtic character of Iberia was already severely attenuated. The Iberian Peninsula was more thoroughly Romanized than Gaul. Moreover, as we saw in an earlier lecture, Spain had not been entirely Celtic-speaking at the time of the Roman conquest. There were groups of non-Celtic Iberian speakers intermingled with the areas of Celtic speech. And this linguistic diversity probably hastened the transition in Roman-ruled Iberia to the Latin language, which of course later gave us Spanish and Portuguese and the other modern vernaculars of the Iberian Peninsula. By the 5th century, the Celtic languages that had been spoken in Spain had declined precipitously. Thus, when the British speakers I spoke about a moment ago arrived in Galicia, there was less of a Celtic language base on which to build, and their influence ultimately dissipated. The local language spoken in Galicia today is on the dialect continuum between Spanish and Portuguese, actually closer to Portuguese than to Spanish. It is certainly not Celtic. And while there are some words of Celtic origin in Galician, comparatively few of them are really directly derived from the local Celtic language. Many of them came into Spanish from elsewhere in the Roman world. Thus, in Galicia, it is much harder to trace Celtic continuity through language. And in fact, if one were to apply a strict definition of Celtic identity related to language, Galicia would have to be classified as post-Celtic. Unlike an area like Cornwall, where the language had died out but was well attested, we just don't have very much of the Galician Celtic language that survives in written form, just a few stone inscriptions. There is just not enough left to revive. We'll talk in a later lecture about if and how a region can claim to be Celtic if it has lost its Celtic language so completely. But one of the most intriguing aspects of Galicia for Celtic enthusiasts comes from the intriguing hints of a connection between Spain and Ireland that I talked about in an earlier lecture. We have seen that the main text about Irish origins, the Book of Invasions, claims that the inhabitants of Ireland came from Spain. Is there any chance that these stories preserve a memory of an actual connection between Spain and Ireland? Well, as I said before, it's not terribly likely that these particular stories are true. There was probably not a literal invasion of Ireland by the Sons of Meal. But, as I also mentioned, the theory that the Celtic languages may have arisen on the Atlantic coast of Europe does present some interesting possibilities. From the few linguistic clues that survive about the Galician Celtic language, it seems to have been a Q-Celtic version of Celtic. Irish is also Q-Celtic, whereas the Celtic languages of Britain are P-Celtic, and Gaulish was probably P-Celtic as well. This would tend to suggest that Celtic made it to Ireland from Spain. So if not the Sons of Meal, perhaps some anonymous traders deep in the remote past brought Celtic to Ireland from Galicia. So, as I said, these stories might be true by accident. There is one other intriguing aspect of the Irish-Spanish connection. We have no evidence that the story of a Spanish origin for the Irish was known in Spain in the early Middle Ages, but it did become widely known many centuries later. And now, the Spanish are very conscious of the existence of this story, and they are not about to let the opportunity go to waste, because this is big tourist business. For example, there is a monument on the Galician coast in A Coruña that has been interpreted as the Tower of Brogan. Brogan is another name for Meal, the father of the first Gaelic settlers in Ireland. It's actually a Roman lighthouse. And just to hammer this connection home, a modern statue of Brogan has been placed at the start of the pathway to the tower, greeting visitors as they approach from the parking lot. Brogan is a character in the Book of Invasions who supposedly built a tower, from which his sons were able to spot the island of Ireland. The modern Galician anthem called The Pines refers explicitly to the story of Brogan. Now, the anthem was written in 1907, at the height of the period we may call the Celtic Revival. It does not represent any kind of authentic connection between the Galician past and Ireland, but it does stake a claim for Celticness. Galicia is now in the midst of a full-blown Celtic revival. The tower is surrounded by a sculpture garden full of artworks referencing the Celtic past. Tour guides at the tower wear kilts that have no relevance to authentic Galician traditions of dress, the better to cement the Celtic connection in the minds of tourists. Now, even if this specific aspect of the Celtic connection between Galicia and Ireland is a bit over the top, there is another aspect of Celtic heritage in Galicia that is much more securely anchored. Galician music has many affinities with music in other parts of the Celtic fringe. In fact, if you listen to Galician music, you can certainly hear the similarities to music from other parts of the Celtic world, and we'll talk more about this music in a later lecture. So even if Galicians don't have a viable Celtic language, they do have music that sounds Celtic. And they may just be able to claim that they helped to turn Ireland Celtic several thousand years ago. Galicia is certainly making every effort to get into the Celtic club. It may be on the fringe of the fringe, but together with Brittany, its Celtic status seems to have been widely accepted by both scholars and, more lucratively, tourists.